chair of the Isle of Man Climate Change Transformation Board. So very interesting presentation. Thank you. I just wonder, bear in mind, our emissions are flattening from the agricultural sector on our netzero.im website. But we have to record them the same way the IPCC recommends or decrees. So I just wonder, in terms of your theory, the calculations, the alternative measures that you've come up with, have you had any traction speaking with IPCC? Because we will continue probably to have to report as the UK does.
So yeah, absolutely, and this is why I emphasised at the end that there's a lot of inertia in the way we report at the moment, and you know, I'm not going to suggest to you that there might be a next year suddenly they might change the entire accounting system and make it reflect warming impact. But what we could do, and there's nothing in the there's nothing in the UN system. In fact, the UN system explicitly encourages people to report other relevant information as appropriate in their inventories, in the so-called greenhouse gas inventories. Seems to me what piece of information could possibly be more relevant to a policy that's supposed to be stopping global warming than the aggregate impact of your emissions on global temperatures. Seems to be about the most relevant information you could come up with. So I would suggest we should be reporting that alongside the emissions that we currently report using the conventional CO2 equivalent metrics. I'm not suggesting stop reporting using the old system, but just report alongside using warming equivalent emissions. And by the way, there's we published a paper earlier this year in which we sort of set ourselves the challenge of trying to get everybody who's published in this space onto the same paper. And the one thing everybody agrees on is report separately, report methane separately from carbon dioxide so that you can work out warming impact. So you could either just report methane separately or you could go just one step further and report warming impact as well as aggregate CO2 equivalent emissions. There's a very high consensus that that's the sensible thing to do if you want to know the impact of your emissions on global temperature.
And sorry, so what traction have you had in terms of getting the system recognised for reporting through the IPCC change?
So okay, so the IPCC, well, I quoted that sentence from the IPCC. The IPCC doesn't dictate how countries report. That's actually done by the UN, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So the IPCC just reports the science, and they actually acknowledged in the most recent IPCC assessment there are various comments in that assessment to say if you want to know the warming impact of your emissions, then you need to use warming equivalent emissions. I mean, it acknowledges, as indeed the sentence I quoted said very explicitly, using the conventional accounting system gets the warming impact wrong. And if you just look at that sentence, the formula I was suggesting you could use just follows from that sentence. So I think there's very high consensus on that's what you need to use if you want to know the warming impact of your emissions. And that's supported by the IPCC. But as I say, the IPCC doesn't determine how emissions are reported. That's the job of the UN, the UN itself, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. They've said explicitly you have to report using GWP 100, using the conventional exchange rate, but you are welcome to report additional information if you see fit. So that's the phrase. I can't remember exactly the words they use, but they explicitly say that countries or companies or whoever's reporting is welcome to report additional information if they see fit. So there's nothing to stop the UK reporting our warming equivalent emissions in our submissions to the UNFCCC other than inertia. And I think if the UK's farmers were to demand it, why not? If you start reporting it as Isle of Man, you could ask, why doesn't the UK do this? It's not that difficult.
Okay, yeah. Paul Crane, the Vice Chair of the Climate Change Transformation Board. I really welcome what you're saying. It was very interesting that the model you put forward, the graphs and some of the stats in it. And the bit that I would just welcome if you said a little bit more clearly, you are not saying that if the Isle herd produces, just like picking a figure out of the air, 10,000 tons of methane in 2023 next year, you're not saying that that actually won't, in its own small way, contribute to the methane in the atmosphere over the next 10, 20, 30 years and won't impact on global warming. Can you just make that clear that methane produced now, today, will impact on global warming for the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, I didn't catch all of that, but basically methane emissions absolutely have an impact against the alternative of not emitting the methane at all. But it's very important to be clear what that impact is. If you're emitting methane, and you have been emitting methane for a long time, and you're emitting it at a constant rate, you're causing some warming, but much less warming than is suggested by conventional accounting metrics. If you stop your methane emissions, or if you start to reduce them rapidly, then you're actually causing cooling. You're actually reducing global temperatures. And just as you would if you planted lots of trees and took carbon dioxide back out of the atmosphere. And I'm not suggesting that wouldn't be a good thing. Of course, that would be a good thing for the planet. And therefore, I would argue that farmers that do that should be rewarded accordingly. And if a farmer chooses to reduce their methane emissions, then they should be rewarded in the same way that another farmer is rewarded if they choose to plant trees instead of growing crops. The difficulty we have at the moment is that if we were to bring methane into an emission trading system, which many people suggest we should do, it is in other sectors. If you were to bring agriculture into the UK emission trading system, the same as, say, the power sector is, then you would be charged, taxed, however you want to put it, for your ongoing methane emissions, even if those methane emissions aren't causing any global warming. And that seems to be an anomaly to me.
Okay.
Hi, you said that the methane oxidizes in carbon dioxide and that's offset by the grass that is used by the herd. Do you have to have 1.7% for that being used, or if their diet is split between grass and other things? Is there a way for accounting for that?
I didn't catch the second half of that very well, sorry.
So could you have a graph for splitting between totally grass-fed and splitting it with maybe cereal-based or some other way of feeding them?
Right, yeah, okay. So well, at the sort of simplest level, whatever you feed your cattle, that carbon will have come out of the atmosphere. I mean, we don't mine carbon and turn it into cattle feed, fortunately. So that means that in the sort of the simple question about do we need to worry about the carbon dioxide that's generated when methane oxidizes in the atmosphere, the simple answer is if the methane comes from a cow, no, we don't. Clearly, the carbon footprint of feed may be very different depending on whether it's, you know, local pasture or whether it's, you know, in an extreme case, if you're purchasing soya feed from a region of Brazil where they're busy cutting down the Amazon rainforest in order to grow soya. I mean, the carbon footprint of your feed may be horrendous and very different from the carbon footprint of local pasture. So yes, we absolutely need to be looking at the climate implications of different decisions that farmers can make, in particular about how they feed their herds, and therefore all the more reason why incentives should be aligned appropriately.
Okay.